The candles had been lit 200 strong, and not one of them found her where she stood at the edge of the gallery, half behind a marble pillar, in a gown that did not belong to her. The silk was the color of unripe wheat, a pale green that took the candlelight and softened it, and it had been cut for a woman 2 inches taller and a season braver. Marietta held herself very straight inside it, so the hem would not betray how it had been turned up and tacked in the dark by her own unsteady fingers. Around her the assembly moved in its slow, bright current, peers and their wives and their marriageable daughters, and every one of them passed her without a flicker. To the room she was no one. That was precisely what she had come to be. She had not meant to look at him. She had promised herself she would not. And then the doors at the far end opened, and the master of the house came through them, and her resolve went the way of all the small resolutions she had made that week. He did not announce himself. Men of his rank never had to. The Duke crossed his own ballroom with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life waited for a door to be held, and the crowd parted and bowed and reformed behind him like water around a stone. He was tall, dark-haired, his face composed into the kind of stillness that the room read as pride, and that Marietta, watching from her pillar, read as something nearer to exhaustion. She knew that stillness. She had seen it once before, in a face that was not his, in a small parlor above a milliner's shop, and the memory of it closed her throat. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the silk at her hip, where sewn into the lining by a hand, now cold in the ground, there was a folded square of paper she had not yet dared to read. You may wonder what a copyist's daughter was doing among the diamonds of 3 counties, wearing a dead woman's ball gown. The answer is the whole of it, and it begins, as these things do, with a death no one of consequence troubled to notice. 6 weeks before the ball, Marietta had buried her sister. Cleone had been the elder by 4 years, the bright one, the one their mother had called her clever girl, before their mother too went into the churchyard at Lower Adby. Where Marietta was quiet and careful and given to disappearing into the margins of a room, Cleone had been all forward motion, all appetite for a larger life than the one a music copyist could give 2 daughters in 3 narrow rooms above a print seller's. Their father had ruled lines on staff paper for the gentry's drawing rooms, and taught both girls to read a score before they could read scripture, and it was Cleone, always Cleone, who had taken that teaching and made something fierce of it. She composed. She filled the backs of their father's spoiled sheets with melodies, in a quick narrow script all her own, and she dreamed, aloud, and often, of a world that would one day listen. That world had not listened. It had been too busy. There was the rub of their whole life. In truth, that the music their father ruled out so carefully went up the great house's stairs to be played by indifferent hands, while the household that had set it down ate bread and dripping and counted the candle ends. Marietta had grown used to it. Cleone never had. Cleone had stood at the print seller's window many an evening watching the carriages go by toward some lit assembly, and had said, with no bitterness, only a kind of hunger, that there was nothing wrong with the world that being heard once would not cure. And then a fever took her in the space of 9 days, quietly, the way it took the poor, without ceremony, and without a physician who would climb the stair more than once for a household that could pay him only in promises. Mr. Maders, Dabby from the apothecary's came twice and left a powder that did nothing, and on the 3rd day he did not come at all, and Marietta had sat through the nights alone, with a basin and a candle and her sister's labored breathing, and had learned how little a careful, quiet, marginless life can buy when it most needs buying. Marietta had washed her sister's body herself. She had folded the thin hands. And on the last night, when the breath had gone shallow and strange, Cleone had gripped her wrist with a strength that should have been long spent and had said a thing that made no sense. The gown, she had said. The green one. He has to see it. He will know. Marietta had thought it the wandering of a fevered mind. She had hushed her and stroked the damp hair back from her sister's brow, and said, "Yes, yes, of course, the way one agrees with the dying. So they may go in peace." Still the words had stayed. They had lodged in her like a splinter under the skin, and in the long, gray weeks afterward, they had begun to ache, because there had been a gown. It hung in the press at the foot of Cleone's bed, wrapped in muslin, far too fine for anything either sister had ever had cause to wear. Pale green silk, an empire waist, sleeves edged in a narrow blonde lace that had cost Marietta, did not doubt, more than their quarter's rent. Marietta had found it 3 days after the funeral, going through her sister's things with the dull thoroughness of grief, and had stood holding it to the light a long while, turning the lace between her fingers, trying to understand where a copyist's daughter had come by a ball gown, and why it had been wrapped and hidden and never once worn. There was a label stitched inside the collar, the work of a modiste named Mrs. Ord, whose narrow shop Marietta knew by sight in the better end of Lower Adby, the sort of shop neither sister had ever had cause to enter. Cleone had never explained it. Cleone had kept a great many things to herself in the last year of her life, had taken to walking out alone. In good weather in a bonnet, she kept brushed and careful, had come home some evenings flushed and luminous, and would say only that she had been to hear music, and that one day, soon, everything would change. Marietta had not pressed her. She had thought it a private happiness, perhaps a young man of their own station, a curate or a clerk, and she had been glad her sister had something bright to set against the narrowness of their days. And she had asked no questions. And now, there was no one left to ask. And then there was the name. Marietta had heard it only once, spoken low when Cleone thought her asleep. Into the dark of the room they shared. A man's name said the way a woman says a name she is afraid to want. She had not understood it then. She understood it now, standing in his house watching him cross his own floor. It had been his. What she did not yet know, as she pressed the hidden paper through the silk, was that her sister had not been mad at the last. Cleone had known exactly what she was asking, and the gown, the green one, was not a relic. It was a message, and Marietta was wearing it into the one room in England where it could be read. The how of her getting there was nearly as improbable as the why. She had not been invited. A copyist's daughter is not invited to a duke's autumn ball. Her father, though, before his hands had begun to shake too badly for the work, had ruled the parts for half the great houses in the county, and among his clients had been the music master at Ransmere Court, a kindly, anxious man named Mr. Brass. Pellow, who owed the late Mr. Fairlow several favors and one outstanding debt. When Marietta came to him a fortnight after the funeral, white-faced and resolute, and asked not for money, but for a way into the ball, he had wrung his hands and refused, and then, because she had her father's eyes and would not look away, he had relented. There was always need, he told her, for an extra pair of hands among the musicians' people on a great night, to turn pages and mind the instruments and fetch and carry below stairs. He could bring her in among them. She would not be a guest. She would be staff, invisible, permitted in the gallery only to serve. If she were discovered above her place, the disgrace would be his as much as hers, and he begged her to remember it. She had promised. And she had meant the promise that first week, yet before the week was out, she had done one thing more, a small thing that would matter more than she knew. She had gone to the narrow shop of the modiste, Mrs. Baybaugh. Orde, the name stitched in the collar, to ask whether the gown had been paid for, because she could not bear to wear a stolen thing, and she had little enough left to settle a debt with. Mrs. Orde was a spare gray woman with a measuring tape always about her neck, and when Marietta gave her sister's name, the careful shop manner dropped clean away. She had known Cleone. She had made the gown for her over the spring, fitting after fitting, on an account that a gentleman had quietly settled the whole of, in May. The modiste said a tall, dark gentleman, who would not give his name, and who had asked only that the work be the finest in her book. The gown was paid, Mrs. Ord told her, paid in full, and then some, and she was sorry, she said, very sorry, for she had liked the young person who had stood for the fittings, and talked of music the whole while. Marietta had thanked her, and gone out into the street, and stood there understanding that her sister's bright secret had had a tailor and a measuring tape and a tall dark gentleman in it, and that the gentleman had paid, and that men do not pay for ball gowns for women they mean to think better of. So the gown had hung in the press, paid for and unworn, and her sister's voice had said he will know, and on the morning of the ball, Marietta had taken the green silk down and held it against herself in the cold light of their one good window. And she had understood that she could not turn pages for the musicians, while the message her sister died asking her to deliver lay folded and silent in a press at home. So she had worn it under her plain gray cloak, and when Mr. Pellow's people went up the back stair, she had gone with them, and at the top, in the dark of a narrow passage hung with linen, she had let the cloak fall. The dismissal, when it came easily, and from a stranger. A lady's maid, sharp-eyed and proprietary, found her in that passage settling the gown, and looked her over from the turn hem to the dressed hair, and said not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone who has placed 1,000 strangers in a moment, "You are not one of ours. You are a tradesman's girl in a borrowed dress, and you have no business on this floor." She had turned away before Marietta could answer, already calling for a footman. And that was the first of the 3 times the room would tell Marietta what she was. A tradesman's girl in a borrowed dress. The maid had been entirely correct, and entirely wrong, and Marietta had slipped past the summoned footman in the press of arriving guests and lost herself in the gallery before the truth of either could be settled. Now she stood behind her pillar and watched the Duke of Ronsmere receive the homage of his county, and she tried to find in his composed dark face some sign of the man her sister had loved. His name was Lucan. She had learned it from Mr. Dessett Pellow, who spoke of his master with the wary fondness of a long servant. The Duke had come into the title young, and into grief younger still. There had been a betrothal, 3 years past, to a girl from a family as old as his own, and the girl had died of a chill caught riding out in March, and the Duke had not spoken of marriage since. He kept to the court. He patronized music, almost to excess, hosting evenings of it that the county attended as one attends a duty, since the master himself never seemed to take any joy in them. He was, Fellow said, a good man gone to stone, and the county had given up waiting for him to thaw. A good man gone to stone. Marietta turned the phrase over. It explained nothing of the gown, nothing of the parlor above the milliner's, where she had once, a year past, gone to fetch Cleone home, and seen through a half-open door a tall, dark gentleman, bent over a writing desk, copying out music in a careful hand. Marietta had withdrawn before either saw her. She had never asked. Cleone guarded her happiness like a wound, and Marietta had learned long ago not to press her. She had seen the stillness in that gentleman's shoulders, all the same. And she saw it now, across the breadth of a ballroom, in the Duke of Ronsmere, and the 2 stillnesses were the same. He patronized music. He copied it himself, in secret, for the love of it. And a girl who composed in a small slanting hand on the backs of spoiled sheets had walked out alone in good weather all that last bright year, and had come home luminous, and had said one day, "Everything will change." Marietta's heart began a slow, hard knocking against the borrowed silk. She did not yet have the shape of it. She had its edges now, though, and the edges were enough to keep her in that room when every sensible instinct told her to take up her cloak and run. She did not run, and because she did not, the dowager found her. The Dowager Countess of Halvergate was a woman of 70 who had outlived 2 husbands and a great many illusions, and who regarded the preservation of rank as the one work left to her in the world. She was the Duke's great-aunt, by marriage and his nearest female relation, and in the absence of a duchess, she had appointed herself the guardian of his house, and his honor, and, above all, of his eventual and correct alliance. She had brought to the ball her particular candidate, and she had no patience to spare for the unaccountable young woman she now observed standing alone, where no young woman of any account would ever stand alone. She approached with the slow inevitability of weather. "I do not know you," she said, and it was not an introduction, but an accusation. Her eyes, pale and shrewd above a great cold weight of diamonds, traveled the green silk and stopped at the lace. Something moved behind them very briefly, a flicker Marietta could not read. "That gown," the dowager said, "is not new." "No, my lady," Marietta said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "It is not new. Whose are you?" It was the question she had no answer for. She was no one's. She belonged to a dead sister and a dying father, and 3 narrow rooms above a print seller's, and none of those would serve in this room. So she said nothing, and her silence was itself a kind of answer. And the dowager's mouth thinned with the satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed. "I thought as much," she said low, for the 2 of them only, and this was the second voicing in a public room, but in a private register. "You are a creature of the back stairs, got up in someone's cast-offs, and you have crept in where you do not belong. I have seen your kind before. They come to a great house on a great night, thinking the dark will hide what they are. It never does." She drew breath to summon someone, exactly as the lady's maid had done, and the Duke of Ransmere, who had been making his slow circuit of his own ball, and had come within a dozen feet of them, without either woman marking it, stopped. He had seen the gown. Marietta did not see his face change, because she was watching the dowager. She heard the small silence open behind her, though, the particular silence of a man of great rank going entirely still. And she turned, and she found him looking at the green silk the way a man looks at a face he had thought he would never see again. For one moment his composure was simply gone. The county would have given a great deal to see it. The master, they thought, past all thawing with the ice, cracked clean through, his dark eyes wide and his careful mouth parted on a breath he had not meant to take. Then it closed over again, as the surface of a pond closes over a thrown thing, and he was the Duke once more, and only Marietta, standing near enough, had caught the moment of his falling. "Aunt," he said. His voice was low and level and gave nothing away. "You are keeping a guest standing." "She is no guest, Ransmere." The dowager's certainty did not waver. "She is an intruder. I was on the point of having her removed." "You will not have her removed." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She is known to me." It was a lie, and it was not. He did not know Marietta. He knew the gown, however, and he had decided in the space of a breath to defend it. And the dowager heard the decision in his tone and did not dare for the moment to contest it before the gathering faces. She inclined her head a fraction, a temporary yielding, and withdrew the length of the room to where her candidate waited, and Marietta understood that she had made in that old woman an enemy who would not yield twice so easily. The Duke offered his arm. "Walk with me," he said. It was one of his commands that were not commands, and she took it, because to refuse would have undone them both, and they went together down the long gallery under the candles, while the county watched and wondered who on earth the master had found. "Where did you get that gown?" he said very quietly when they had outpaced the nearest ears. "It was my sister's," Marietta said. She felt the slight stiffening of the arm under her hand. "Your sister?" he said, Cleone. She said the name and felt it leave her. "Like the first stone out of a wall, Cleone Fairlow. She died 6 weeks ago of a fever, in the rooms we shared above the print cellar in Lower Adby. The last thing she asked of me was that I wear this gown where you would see it. She said you would know." Her voice did not break, though it cost her not to let it. I did not understand what she meant. He had stopped walking. They stood at the dark end of the gallery, before a tall window full of night, and his reflection and hers hung in the black glass beside the candle flames, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The level command had gone out of it, and what was left was barer and younger, and very nearly unsteady. "I copied music with a young woman named Fairlow," he said, "for the better part of a year. She had a gift I have not met its equal of in any drawing room in England. She wrote a setting of an old air that last spring that I have not been able to put out of my head since I had it made up fair. I meant to have it performed here tonight, and to find her in the room when it was played, and to ask her, before all of them, a question I had been too great a coward to ask in a milliner's parlor." He drew a breath that shook. She stopped coming in May. She sent no word. I went to the milliner and was told only that the young person had ceased to call. I did not know where she lived. I did not know she was ill. I have spent the summer believing she had thought better of a duke who copied music like a clerk and had simply gone. She did not go, Marietta said. She was buried at Lower Adby on the 14th of September, and she was thinking of you when she died. He turned from the window then and looked at her fully, and she saw that the man the county believed past all feeling was weeping, silently and without any care for who might see, 2 tears tracking down a face the county believed incapable of them. What did she ask you to bring me? He said. Marietta put her hand to the silk at her hip, where the folded paper had ridden all evening against her like a second heart. I do not know yet, she said. I have not been able to read it. I only knew that it was here. Be patient here, the way the night asked patience of her, because what she drew from the lining of that gown was not a love letter, and the reading of it would take the rest of the evening, and very nearly cost her everything. The paper unfolded was a page of music, a single melody in a small, slanting hand, the staff lines ruled by their father, and the notes set down by Cleone, and beneath the final bar few words in the same slant. For L, who heard me. Finish it. See. The Duke read it over her shoulder, and she felt him go very still. And then he said a thing she did not expect. It is unfinished, he said. She left it on the dominant. She always did that when she meant to argue with me about the ending. A sound came out of him that was half a laugh and half a sob. She is asking me to finish it. Here tonight. Can you? I can play what she wrote. The rest I would have to find in front of all of them, and I have not played before company since I was a boy. He looked at the page, and then at her, and something settled in his face, the stone reorganizing itself around a decision. But she did not die asking a small thing of me. I will not answer it with a small thing. What followed? Marietta would remember in pieces for the rest of her life, the way one remembers the few minutes that turn the whole of a life on its hinge. He went to the musicians' gallery and spoke to Mr. Distordent. Pello, who went white, and then red, and then looking once at Marietta with the expression of a man watching his own ruin approach and finding he did not mind it after all, began to clear the instruments from the great pianoforte at the room's head. The county censing event drew in around the open floor. The dowager came forward with her candidate on her arm, a handsome, composed young woman in pale blue, whose name Marietta did not yet know, and arranged herself where she could best command the scene, and her pale eyes found Marietta in the press. The Duke of Ransmere sat down at his own pianoforte before the assembled gentry of 3 counties and set a single page of music, ruled by a dead copyist and written by his dead daughter, upon the stand. And then, before he could sound a note, the dowager struck. She had not built her certainty on nothing, and she did not intend to watch her great-nephew make a public spectacle of himself over a backstairs creature in a stolen gown without a fight. She stepped into the cleared floor, and she raised her voice so the whole room would have it. And she said, Before you indulge us, Ransmere, the company should know what manner of person has charmed you into this. That young woman came up the servants' stair tonight among the musicians' people. My own maid found her changing out of a tradesman's cloak in the linen passage not 2 hours past. The gown she wears was got from a milliner in Lower Adby, on an account opened by a tradesman's daughter, who could never in this life have meant to pay it. I have had it inquired into since she would not give her name, and I have the modiste's own word that the thing was ordered on nothing but a promise. She had done her work in the gaps of the evening, sent a footman to Lower Adby and back, gathered her facts, and she laid them down now like a winning hand. She is an impostor and a thief, and that page she carries she stole along with the dress. I will not stand by and see the honor of this house given to a swindler who has crept in to snare a grieving man. It was the 3rd voicing, the cruelest, made before the whole assembly, and it was clever, because the bones of it were true. Marietta had come up the servants' stair. She had changed in the linen passage. The account had indeed been opened on a promise, in the spring. The dowager had her facts in a row and had not troubled to ask the one question that would have unmade them, which was who, in May, had quietly paid the promise off. A murmur went through the gathering, the quick turning of a crowd that has been told whom to despise, and Marietta felt the floor of the evening drop away beneath her. She might have fled. The old woman had built her a clear road to the door, and the room had cleared it wider. Yet Cleone had not crept up a back stair and worn out her last bright year in a milliner's parlor, and died with this music in her mouth, so that her sister might run from a hard old woman's true and twisted account. So Marietta stepped into the cleared floor instead. "Nearly every word of that is true," she said, and her voice carried, because the room had gone silent to hear her condemned, and she gave it her confession instead. "I came up the servants' stair. I changed in the linen passage. The gown was made for my sister, a year ago, on an account opened, with a promise of a modiste named Mrs. Orr, in Lower Adby, who fitted her through the spring and liked her. I am a copyist's daughter. I have no name that means anything in this room." She turned slowly so that she faced not the dowager, but the Duke, at his instrument. "But your ladyship asked the wrong question of Mrs. Ord. You asked who ordered the gown. You did not ask who paid for it. It was paid in full in the month of May, by a gentleman who would not give his name, and there is one man in this house who can say whether that is a lie." She let the silence hold a moment. "And I did not steal this music. My sister wrote it. Her name was Cleone Fairlow, and she ruled her first staff lines on her own father's knee. And if there is any soul here who can say whether the hand that set down these notes was a thief's hand, or the truest musician this county has ever failed to listen to, it is the man at that pianoforte. I will abide by his judgment. I have come a long way to be judged by it." The room held its breath. The Duke spoke, before the dowager could. "I paid Mrs. Gra. Ord's account in May," he said quite plainly, into the silence, and the words fell among the gentry like stones into still water. "I will not pretend before this company that I did not. So that charge, aunt, is answered, and answered by me." The dowager opened her mouth, and shut it, and the floor she had stood so firmly upon shifted under her for the first time that evening, and the Duke of Ransmere began to play. He played the melody as Cleone had written it, simply, almost plainly, letting the notes say themselves, and the room that had come to see a swindler exposed fell silent under it because the thing was beautiful and there was no arguing with a beautiful thing. He played to the final bar she had set down, the one that ended on the unresolved note, the question she had left for him. And there he paused, his hands above the keys, and the silence after the unfinished phrase was the loudest sound in the house. Then he finished it. What he found in those next bars, Marietta could not have written down, and the musicians in the gallery would argue about for years, but it answered the question her sister had left hanging. It took the suspended note and brought it home, gently, by a road no one had foreseen, and everyone, hearing it, knew at once to be the only right one. It was a man completing a sentence a woman he had loved had begun. It was grief, and it was tenderness, and it was at the very last, in a turn toward the Major, that lifted the whole room's heart into its throat. Something very like joy, and when the final chord had died away into the candle smoke, the Duke of Ransmere sat with his hands still on the keys, and into the enormous silence he spoke, not loudly, looking only at Marietta. "I would know that hand among 10,000, he said. "No thief wrote this." 7 words of judgment, and the room rendered its verdict with him, because they had heard the truth of it in the music, and could no more disbelieve it than disbelieve their own ears. The murmur that went through the gathering now was of a different temper altogether, and it turned, as such murmurs do, against the one who had misled them. The dowager stood very straight in the center of the cleared floor with all her diamonds and all her certainty, and for a moment Marietta saw the calculation behind her pale eyes falter, the old woman casting about for the next move in a game she had always, until this room, won. She found none. The facts she had marshaled were all true and had all been turned, and the company that had been hers a moment past now waited, faintly appalled to see what she would do. She had overreached. She had meant to expose a swindler, and had instead exposed a grieving man's reclaimed happiness to the cruelest possible light, and the displacement she had earned came not from any cruelty of the Duke's, but from the plain weight of what the room had heard. "Niece," the dowager began, to her candidate, the young woman in blue reaching for the arm of the alliance she had come to secure. The young woman in blue had heard the music too, however. She drew her arm gently back. "I think, my lady," she said low, with a composure that did her credit, "that His Grace's heart was spoken for before we came." And she stepped aside, and in stepping aside, she left the dowager alone in the middle of the floor with nothing to hold. The old woman's mouth worked. The polished sentences that had served her for 70 years deserted her, and what came out was fragmented and small. "The gown," she said. "On credit. I only meant the honor of the house." She stopped. She looked, for the first time that evening, every one of her 70 years. And Marietta, who had every reason to wish her humbled, found to her own surprise that she could take no pleasure in it. It was the Duke who ended it, and he ended it gently, because the habit of mercy was deeper in him than the wish to win. He rose from the pianoforte and crossed to his great-aunt and took her hand. The hand that had tried to throw Marietta out of his house, and he bowed over it as correctly as he had ever bowed over anything. "You have guarded my honor faithfully for 3 years, Aunt," he said, so that the room could hear. "And I have given you a hard charge, mourning as I have been, and telling you nothing of why. The fault in that is mine, and not yours. The honor of this house, though, is safe tonight, safer than it has been since my mother died. And I will thank you to welcome the young woman who has restored it to me." He said it kindly. He left the dowager, her dignity, even as he took from her the field. And the old woman, who was confidently wrong but not in the end a fool, looked from her great-nephew's steady face to Marietta's, and seemed to understand at last what she had been fighting, and inclined her head, and was silent. The county, given its cue, began to breathe again. The musicians, uncertain, took up a quiet air, and the Duke of Ransmere turned from his great-aunt, and crossed the small distance to where Marietta stood, alone, in her sister's green gown, in the middle of his ballroom, and he stopped before her and looked at her as though she were the only person in the house. "I have been a coward for a year," he said low, "for her alone now. I was too proud to court a copyist in the open, and so I courted her in secret, and my secrecy left me no road to her when she fell ill, and she died, believing I might have thought better of her. I have to live with that, but I will not be a coward twice." He took her hand. He did it before all of them, slowly, deliberately, in the same room where the dowager had named her a thief, so that the gesture would carry the weight the accusation had carried, and more. "Marietta Fairlow," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and he said it as though he had been saving it. "Your sister asked me to finish her music. Let me finish it properly. Stay, not tonight only. Stay, and let me spend the rest of a long life learning the gift your family carries. And let me give your father a warm room and your sister a name this county will not forget. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking it here, where they all heard the other thing so that there can be no mistaking, which is true. The whole room had heard. That was the point of it. Marietta found that she could not speak. She had come into this house to deliver a dead woman's message, and be gone before dawn. And she stood now in the cleared center of a duke's ball with her hand in his and 100 faces turned toward her. And the message was delivered. And the messenger had been seen. She thought of Cleone in the dark of their shared room, saying a man's name she was afraid to want. She thought of the unfinished melody brought home to its resolving chord. She thought of her father shaking hands, and the cold churchyard at Lower Adby, and the long gray weeks of carrying this alone. "Yes," she said. It was a small word, and it filled the room. "Yes, I will." What came after, the betrothal made formal and the county's astonishment turning by slow degrees into the warm satisfaction a crowd takes in a love story once it is decided to approve. Marietta watched as from a little distance, still half unable to believe the floor she stood on was real. The dowager left early. With what dignity she had gathered back to herself, and sent, 3 days later, a stiff, short note of welcome that was, from such a woman, a surrender and a kindness both. The young woman in blue, whose name was learned at last to be Lady Sabra Venner, danced twice more and went home, and was by all accounts not sorry. She had not wanted the Duke either, only the doing of what was expected, and she had been quietly glad to be released from it. All of that belonged to the great world, though, and Marietta found, in the end, that the great world was not where the knight had lived. The knight had lived in the music, and in a folded page, and in a sister's last clear-eyed gift. That was the autumn. By the following spring she was the Duchess of Ransmere, married quietly in the old chapel at the court with her father, his hands steadier in the warm rooms he had been given, weeping in the front pew, and Mr. Brynan met, Pello at the organ, playing a setting no one in the county had heard before. It was Cleone's melody, finished. The Duke had had it engraved, the small slanting hand of the first half, and his own careful hand of the second, set down together on a single sheet, and beneath the final resolving bar he had had the engraver letter, the words that had been on the page Marietta carried out of the gown that night, and one line more of his own. For L, who heard me, finish it. C, and below it, in the Duke's own line, the words, "It is finished," and it is hers. They performed it every autumn after, on the anniversary of the ball, in the great room where the Duke had played it the first time. Marietta would sit near the pianoforte in a gown of her own, now well made and paid for, and she would listen to her sister's music, brought home to its ending, and she would think that Cleone had been right, that last fevered night in a way she could never have known. The gown had been a message. He had seen it. He had known. And on the evening after that first performance, when the guests had gone and the candles were burning low, the Duke found his wife standing at the tall dark window at the end of the gallery, where they had stood on the night of the ball, looking at the two reflections hung in the black glass beside the flames. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then he took her hand, the way he had taken it before the whole county once, and held it. On the small table beneath the window lay the original page, the one she had carried out of the lining of a dead woman's gown, kept now under glass, the ruled lines and the small slanting notes, and the words that had asked a coward to be brave. Marietta looked at it and then at the knight, and then at the steady, dark face of the man her sister's last gift had given her. If Marietta's journey has stayed with you, sit a moment longer in the quiet of it before you go, and remember that the things we carry for the dead are not always burdens. Sometimes they are doors. Outside the snow had begun, the first of the year falling slow and white past the black glass and gathering on the cold stone of the court, and somewhere below them in the warm house, a fire was settling in its grate, and the page lay under its glass where the candlelight could reach it. Marietta turned from the window and laid her head against her husband's shoulder, and they stood together in the hush of the great room, two reflections in the dark, and let the snow come down.